morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the first In Conversation session about the right to artistic freedom in an age of complexity. My name is Mika Romanus, and I am the Director General of the Swedish Art Grants Committee, which is one of IFACA's associate members here in Sweden. We are a government agency with a task to promote artistic development by improving the economic and social conditions for professional artists here in Sweden. And we work toward artists in all artistic disciplines. As a government agency, we are responsible for the implementation of Swedish national cultural policy directed toward the individual artists. And this includes the mission to follow, analyze and report on changes in their income and other terms that would affect the artists. And our work shows that the transformation of the market has led to descending conditions and revenues. So to strengthen the professional condition of artists is an essential possibility for them to use their independence and experience their artistic freedom. In a newly published report by the Council of Europe by Sarah Wyatt, who will be speaking here later this afternoon, that identifies both above the radar threats to artistic freedom and under the radar threats. Above the radar threats are attacks, for example, arrests, prosecution and imprisonment, and under the radar threats are more subtle ones, such as administrative restrictions, the denial of production and presentation spaces, as well as financial uncertainty. And all these threats can lead to self-censorship and affect the artistic freedom. Already in 1980, UNESCO published recommendations concerning the status of the artist that recognized the liberties and the rights of artists. Government should help to create and sustain a climate encouraging freedom of artistic expression and the material conditions facilitating the release of creative talents. And the document also stresses that artists shall benefit from the rights and protection provided for in international and national legislation relating to human rights. United Nations International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights offers a solid foundation for the rights to artistic freedom. Article 19 states that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference, and everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. And this right shall include freedom to seek and receive information and ideas of all kinds, including in the form of art. Article 15 recognizes the right of everyone to take part in the cultural life, as well as to benefit from the protection of material interests resulting from literary or artistic production. So there are several universal, regional, and international instruments that aim at safeguarding artistic freedom in different perspectives. But as the headline of this conversation that we soon will hear, it's complicated. We live in an age of complexity with challenges and obstacles to artistic freedom, and in a world where the cultural rights are very unequally distributed. International reports point out that the understanding on artistic freedom differs around the world due to lack of sufficient knowledge about artistic freedom, deficiencies in democratic rights, as well as limited know-how of the culture sector in general. Protecting artistic freedom calls for continuous efforts, and it requires contributions that crosses borders between policy domains and disciplines, as well as between nations and continents. Therefore, the dialogue these coming days and the continuously international exchange must be of high priority. The format of this morning's session will be a conversation between two very distinguished experts who will share some of their experiences of investigating and debating the right to artistic freedom. And by listening to their conversation, we will be able to broaden our horizon and build a common understanding of the challenges that we face to obtain artistic freedom. There will be no moderation and there will be no Q&A. It will be a conversation. And it's a great honor to introduce the participants at the World Summit of Ithaca's first discussion about the right to artistic freedom. Please welcome on stage Ms. Alexandra Xanthaki and Mr. Shahidul Alam. I'll just make sure the questions are on the table, because this will be dialogue between these people. Welcome on stage. Ms. Xanthaki is the UN Special Rapporteur in Cultural Rights, and she has been published extensively in areas such as cultural rights of minority and indigenous people, cultural diversity, cultural heritage, balancing the cultural rights with other rights and interests, and multicultural aspects of international human rights law. Mr. Alam is a photographer, journalist, and an activist who has suffered the consequences of violation of artistic freedom in his struggle for democracy in Bangladesh. He was arrested in 2018 for criticizing his government, but was released following a global campaign. I will now leave the floor to you to have your conversation and to discuss the topic of artistic freedom in an age of complexity. But before I leave, I would like to just start you off with one very open question. Why is artistic freedom important to you personally? And what new threats to artistic freedom has occurred during the years you have been actively working with these issues?
Well, thank you, Mika. And thank you all. I mean, this is a fantastic audience, and thank you for having me here. I'd actually like to pick up on some of the things that were said in the introductory panel. I mean, it was mentioned very eloquently that there are similarities in the language that is used by various governments. And I recognize that. I mean, the reality is, while most governments wax lyrical about freedom and democracy in their rhetoric, most governments suppress it actively in their practice. That goes across the board. There is a variation, but I'd like to point out that that does exist. And there, I'd like to actually turn it around a little bit in the sense that if you look at the Freedom of Index, Scandinavian countries come right up there. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, right up there. Bangladesh, my country, is number 162, scraping the bottom, somewhere near there. It's a matter of concern, and of course, as a Bangladeshi, I do have a concern about what happens in Bangladesh. But I would like to ask the countries that are on the top three, what are they doing with their freedoms? What are the journalists and the artists in these countries doing to exercise that freedom, to value it, to put it to action? What are they doing to ask their own governments hard questions about their reactions across the globe? I completely agree and sympathize with my Ukrainian friends in terms of how they're being attacked, how their rights, and everything else that is happening. I'm in complete solidarity with Ukraine. I have huge concerns that the same governments that say this are conveniently silent when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to a whole lot of other aggressions across the globe. I completely agree that the women in Iran should be celebrated and the suppression in Iran should be questioned. I'd like to remind you that Mossadegh was a democratically elected government who was selectively removed to institute in place a process of dictatorship that has led to where we are now. So that culpability is something that we cannot ignore. It's an uncomfortable thing, and I say it because that, I think, refers to what she's saying. I mean, artist's job is perhaps to give you pleasure, perhaps to enlighten you and a whole lot of other things, but it is also to make you uncomfortable. I think it is our job to ensure that you're disturbed in your sleep. I think it is our job to ensure that when things go wrong, you cannot simply walk away. You cannot turn away. And I think it is important to remember that that is our job. So when we are in the position that we are, and I'll give you a practical example, which also refers to this. I'm here today. Sunday morning, I was in court. I was picked up illegally nearly 5 years ago. I was tortured. I spent time in jail. I spent time in something that the government called remand, which is a euphemism for state-sanctioned torture. But I'm out, I'm here now, I'm speaking to you, I'm being broadcast, and I do it knowing that my government dislikes everything that I do because I have a job to do. I, as an artist, I have taken on that responsibility of becoming a conscience, of pointing out all the things that are wrong. That will cause problems for me and for others around me, but it is something that I need to willingly take on. And I think it is important to remind ourselves constantly that it is not an easy path. It will never be an easy path. And if at one point it becomes an easy path, you need to imagine what you're doing. Perhaps you're not doing things right. Because if you're doing it right, it will not be easy. That is part of the path that we have chosen to take. And that is where we stand. Of course, it's a conversation, so I don't want to make it a monologue. I'd just like to remind you of things that have happened. I mean, Magdalena very evocatively mentioned the role that Sweden had played in freeing people in Chile. I must also remind you and thank the Swedish government, because there are journalists and artists here in Sweden today who are in exile because they've been persecuted in Bangladesh. 3rd of May is a very important day for what we are here today. 3rd of May also happens to be the birthday of a mother in Bangladesh, Jahanari Imam, who wrote a very poignant diary, an evocative diary, because in 1971, during our War of Liberation, her son had been taken away and killed by the military. And this very evocative diary reminds us not only of what we who call ourselves artists practice, but at an individual level, every citizen, every mother plays a role and has a role to play. So I thank you for this, but let's go on with our conversation.
Thank you very much. So I was asked why art is important, and I think that if you see Shahidul's photography, you will understand immediately why it is important, and a lot of the work that a lot of you are doing, because it moves us, because it shocks us, because it surprises us, because it helps us imagine, because it relates to our past and gives us ideas about our future. And I think that it is important to remember the creativity aspect. So in my work as the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, I feel, I'll let you into a secret, I feel a little bit annoyed when people see artistic freedom only as part of freedom of expression. I think freedom of expression is a very well-recognized right, and it helps us promote artistic freedom. However, like Mika did, we have to see it in connection to cultural rights, because cultural rights are about show the creativity, show the collective and personal memories, indicate the importance of being moved, being surprised, being shocked. And that's what that's why I promote seeing artistic freedom as part of freedom of expression, and also as part of the right to participate in culture. I think one of my challenges, and one of the challenges that I can see, is fragmentation. And I think that Shahidul talked about that a little bit indirectly. I see fragmentation in the way artistic freedom is understood, and sometimes I wonder, after I've been in meetings for 10 hours and my cynical self comes through, I wonder whether states choose to see artistic freedom only as the part that they are interested in, rather than having a wider and more inclusive understanding of what artistic freedom means and what it entails. But I also see fragmentation in terms of the civil society. I come from research on indigenous rights, and the indigenous rights movement is such an excellent example of people and groups who are different and maybe have claims that are varied, but they have come together, they have acknowledged their differences, but they have put them aside for the common cause. And civil society is not very vocal at the international practice. They're not very vocal when I speak to states about cultural rights and migration, about sustainable development and cultural rights, and how these connect to the cultural sector and artistic freedom. So I think that if maybe these 3 days are going to be important, and they're going to be important for so many different ways, and they have already made a difference in networking and in meeting each other and speaking about important issues. I hope that they're also going to be important in bringing together, but really bringing together the different actors and really allowing to focus on the common causes and the common claims, because this is the only way that then the states are going to listen and the states are going to react. So I was wondering whether in your work and in what you have faced, you have had support from the civil society, from other artists, or whether you felt at times that you were lonely.
There are lonely times, of course. I cannot deny that. But I think the reason I'm here today speaking to you is because over a dozen Nobel laureates, celebrities across the globe, campaigned, people in the streets of all sorts of places, including back streets of Ghana, came out in protests. I think I owe it to that. But really, the people who took the biggest risks were the people in Bangladesh. They were the ones who faced far bigger threats by protesting out there vociferously, taking enormous risks. And while the spotlight is on someone like me, one forgets that it is actually the people around you who in many ways suffer more. They're the ones who have to deal with the legal issues, the medical issues, the security issues, and a whole lot of other things that happen while you are hopefully safe in jail. I mean, those are very, very important issues. But I would like to take up on what you just said, actually, in terms of what governments can do. I mean, not just governments, I mean, corporations, governments, powerful entities. They all behave in the same way, and there is a nexus often between them. They have money, they have muscle. One of the things we have is creativity. And we don't always exercise that sufficiently. And I think it is important to remember that the problem really is that we have a difficult balancing act to play. On the one hand, our task requires us to be sensitive, but because of this repression, we're also required to be thick-skinned. And it's a duality that doesn't always come up very naturally. And it comes up because the reason we have to be thick-skinned is because the power elite is worried about what we do, is worried about our creativity, is worried that we, through our work, can get under the skin. We, through our work, can evoke emotions, reactions, which the standard processes cannot do. And the reason I think that happens, and this is perhaps how we need to turn it around, because the reason these powerful entities are worried about us and try and suppress us is because they lack legitimacy. And if you look at it, it is the ones who lack the legitimacy the most who are the most scared, understandably. And they're the ones who we threaten by what we do, what we say, and what we promise to do.
And I think you're absolutely right. And states in my work, states sometimes see artistic freedom and the protection of the artists almost as good practice, almost as a charity, almost as something that they're very proud about. And I have to remind them that this is the minimum standards. This is, their obligations. They're not supposed to protect artists and artistic freedom because they're nice. They're supposed to protect the artistic freedom because they have signed and ratified international instruments that where they have undertaken this obligation. And sometimes I smile when I shouldn't, because they come to me and they say how artistic freedom is violated in the other state. So they come and they say to me how we should protect the artists in the other states. In Afghanistan, we must protect them. In Iran, we must protect them. In Bangladesh, of course. In Ukraine, absolutely. However, sometimes I just want to say, just take a mirror and look at yourselves as well. And maybe the violations are not going to be as massive or as extreme. So, very often they say, of course, in my country we have freedom. But it's not as binary, it's not as black and white. Even in countries where the rule of law works better, artists suffer from financial insecurity, from lack of social security and insurance. Very often the arts councils pursue a very specific understanding of the arts. We still see very often that what is funded is the high arts, what is considered to be high arts, or what is considered to be the traditional art, rather than art that shocks. We see the artists that are of migrant origin, to have to step back because the foreign artists that are required protection come and are preferred. So, these are all issues that we see in states that they do have money, they do prioritize arts and artistic freedom. So I think that it is very important to open up this idea of violations and weaknesses in the protection of artistic freedom, and to certainly focus on important areas of the world where artistic freedom is, violated in a very real and high level. But at the same time also work towards all the states have artists that are not protected as much as they should, from direct discrimination but also from indirect discrimination, from the instrumentalization of the art, or from a very specific understanding of the art. So I completely agree with you. States do have responsibility.
I'd like to take up something you've mentioned earlier about fragmentation. By the way, I'm looking at these questions that have come in, yes, and I'm going to share them with you as well. We can't take all of them, but I think in a sense they are being addressed through what we're talking about. But you mentioned fragmentation, and when certainly in practice, before I was known in professional circles, I wasn't really known by the average person in the street. Once I got picked up and all the things that happened, the average person in the street began to know me. I mean, so in a sense, I need to thank the government for what they did. I mean, not that I'm recommending jail for anyone, but the point remains that there was a time when I was in jail. Certain people, and many people across the globe, stood up and spoke, but there were also silences. And in a country like mine, which has such a tremendous tradition of artists having resisted, I believe one of the reasons we're in this problematic situation today is because too many of us are silent. And too many of us who consider ourselves to be good people, progressive people, take the choice of looking the other way. And I think it is the silence of this majority that is more our problem. Repressive regimes exist everywhere, and people who are in power tend to hang on to power. That's the way things work. I don't think we will change that. A different regime will not necessarily behave differently because the mechanisms through which they arrive there are very similar. But I think for us, and we need to ask these questions at each and every one of us, and that's why I raised that question right at the beginning. For us to stay silent when we should be speaking is an act of culpability. And I don't think we can avoid that. There is, sorry, go on.
I think you're absolutely right. And for example, unfortunately, the United Nations does not give me the funds to go to specific places and look for violations. So I really have to rely on the civil society telling me what the violations are. So in this respect, we need non-governmental organizations. We need civil society that will have the funds, the freedom, and some sort at least of security that they can tell us about what's happening on the ground. So artistic freedom can only be secured when there are also guarantees for human rights defenders, or when there are also guarantees of some gender equality and some non-discrimination. So artistic freedom relies on not just the freedom of expression and cultural rights, but also a number of other rights that makes it effective.
Thank you for that. I mean, Ithaca, Magdalena mentioned that it was a long word, a long term, several letters expanded into long words. For me, what was very interesting was the last word, agency. The word agency there perhaps is used in a different sense, but I think our agency is something we also need to take into account. And while I completely agree that those rights need to be given, it is also the reality that rights generally do not come by themselves. You have to fight for them, you have to extract them, and it is a continuous struggle. It is not something that once you get it, you can relax and step back and it'll be there forever. No, it is a perennial struggle that all of us have, and that we collectively need to have. We need to reinforce each other constantly for being able to do that. I'd like to go to one of the questions. This is from the Australian artist Brooke Andrew, and I'll just read it out. Large established Western mediums have a legacy of controlling the dominant art market and hence artists. In my experience, indigenous artists are still misunderstood by the larger institutes. When will these institutes allow for the realization of indigenous directives in controlling and expressing their own narratives and histories? There still exists great ignorance and control over our narrative to the point where many of these institutions still do not understand our cultures. Thank you, Brooke, for that question. But again, I think it is a question of power relationships. And the reality is that those in power tend to ignore those who are powerless. And it is up to us to turn it around and subvert that space. One does it in many different ways. I brought this bag up. It's an advert. And I did it deliberately. The image is of a young man with writing on his back. His name was Nur Hussain, a worker who, when we were trying to bring down a military dictator, came out into the streets with this writing on his back saying, "Let democracy be freed." On the 10th of November 1987, that was the day he came out, he was shot dead by the police and has since become a symbol of our democracy. One of the problems we have, and I'm being practical here, one of the problems we have is that there are many people who perhaps sympathize, would like to be involved, would like to play a role, but are scared. And particularly when there's repressive regime, when things like disappearances and deaths take place, understandably, they're worried. One of our challenges is to transform these people into some way into getting agency, to playing a role. And one of the things we've started doing is a thing called Chintar Korak in Bangla, which literally translates to food for thought. And we've begun a series of merchandise, bags, mugs, coasters, T-shirts, which are provocative in some way. And while someone might be hesitant to march in the streets or make a slogan, and in today's age, even put a like or share on Facebook, because that can get you in jail in a country like Bangladesh. Perhaps you're okay with drinking from a mug that protests, or carrying a tote bag that has a message. And we have to actually find ways in which we allow or create the space for a larger fraternity to be involved. And as Magdalena said, this is a village. And the way a village operates is very different from the way an urban center operates, which is much more fragmented, atomized, nuclearized. We work as a collective. We share what we do. We give strength to one another. We look out for one another. And I think those are perhaps some of the ways in which we can work.
So, this goes back to what, the wonderful concept of cultural rights and how they are protected. So artistic freedom of indigenous peoples is a very big debate that has to be explored more. And artistic freedom through cultural rights does give the opportunity for collective recognition. So we can talk about collective recognition of indigenous art. And the indigenous movement, the transnational indigenous movement, has done wonders in recognizing this right, and a lot of us can take lessons from it. But of course, problems still exist. And I'm going to link this with the second question, that is, what are the rights and responsibilities associated with the receipt of public funds for artistic projects? So my understanding is that very often arts councils give very little money to, for example, the Sami, to protect their art and their artistic freedom. They don't fully understand the state mechanisms, and also art councils do not really understand how this money can be used in a way that is not going to be as individualistic as we have been focused on when it comes to artistic freedom. And so I think that this is something that is very real and can change quite easily, so that substantive equality does prevail. And I think for me, this is one of the most important responsibilities of art councils, to ensure that real equality exists. And the information that I get is that very often we have the elite of the society that are represented in the art councils, but we don't, which means that the funding is going to go to these very established understandings of art. And I also hear that sometimes migrant or minority artists are represented in a tokenistic way. So look, we have one minority artist. Oh my God, we have one female minority artist. We have one LGBT female minority artist. So I think, and I think that this does not really ensure real equality. So the understanding and how these funding bodies understand art is very important. What is the representation of the artistic world in the bodies that are going to fund art is very important. And also I think some understanding of the principles of the human rights principles that they have to adhere to. I was shocked to hear some of the conversations that take place in some of these art councils that would not really be taking place publicly. So I think that for me, these are some of the responsibilities that the the bodies, art councils, and more generally, bodies that focus on public funds have. And I think also sometimes artists and artists from Nordic countries recently have told me that they feel that art is instrumentalized. So they feel that, you know, for some, art is political, and yes, of course, it should be funded. But for others, art is not political, and you know, this part should also be funded as well. So I think that these are some of the rights and responsibilities that I would see. Just go for inclusiveness, and inclusiveness means being very harsh with ourselves and try to understand our own stereotypes, our own bias, that then we mirror to the decisions we pursue.
Well, thank you for that. But I'd like to go on to actually return to the original question, because I don't think I answered it sufficiently, in the sense that indigenous communities exist across the globe. They are, by definition, I wouldn't say by definition, but certainly in practice, they are the minority, and they are often the ones who are marginalized in many ways. And one forgets how their spaces are appropriated as well. In Bangladesh, we have the Chittagong Hill Tracts. It has been under military occupation ever since we began. And when we consider that a country like Bangladesh was born through the fight to speak our own language, I mean, that was what was the basis of our fight for independence. So many people gave their lives to be able to speak so we could speak Bangla. But then, having won that right, having become an independent state, we suppress other people's rights to speak their language. And therefore there is this thing that, you know, and there is a problem with definitions of democracy. If definitions of democracy is simply restricted to the majority, or the first past the post, then I think we've misunderstood what the word means. I think it is about recognizing every person's right and space, and creating that space, and actively respecting every person within the community. And there we have a serious problem, where if we happen to be the majority, if we happen to be the dominant group, for whatever reason, we exercise that right to stamp whatever else is there. And that, perhaps, is the problem. So the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh has been under military control for over 50 years. Yet it is not something that's talked about. There was a peace treaty at some point made, completely forgotten. Now, these are people who will never rule the land, because they will never be the majority. They will never, through a democratic process, have a say. But I think if we believe in the word democracy, it relates to the governed having a say in the process of governance. And unless we include within that term governed every person who is governed, we've actually not understood what that language means. And I think what we also need to do, perhaps, and you are within the UN, you are within the hierarchies that can play that role, I do think it is worthwhile reminding the regimes that are in place that their legitimacy is undermined through our suppression. Because it is only the fact that they have to suppress us that is the manifestation of their illegitimacy. If they were legitimate, if they were accepted, if they were the representatives of the people, they would not need to suppress us in the way they do. And perhaps that is a message that we need to get across. There is another term that I think it's worth bringing up, though it's not directly related to this, and that is to do with a term that's quite often flouted: development, you know, progress, development. And it's said, well, you know, we can put those things aside. Human rights, artistic rights, cultural rights, they come afterwards. Let's have development first. Now, I spent over 107 days in jail. While I was in jail, I had shelter, I had food, I had clothing. My basic needs were met. I was not free, And that is certainly not where I want it to be. Why should we assume that the average person should be satisfied with merely having shelter, food, the basic needs, but be deprived of their rights? And I think not only the rights in terms of everyday needs, but across the board. One of the things that happened very recently was, sorry,
That's okay.
we've got a signal, yeah. The red signal, okay, we better be careful. It's like football. But one of the things, and I will end with this, one of the things that happened very recently is there was a journalist who on our Independence Day talked about, there was a photograph of a child looking at our symbol of independence, the Martyrs' Memorial. And the statement was, if my sovereignty does not give me food, if my sovereignty does not give me my basic needs, that sovereignty means nothing to me. That journalist was arrested. The arrest warrant was about to be issued against the editor, and it was only a huge, massive public outcry that led to the journalist eventually being released. But I think that is what we need to do. We need to remind them that they are our representatives, and that unless, and we need to remind ourselves that our agency requires us to act differently. And unless we use that last word, agency, within Ithaca, we probably failed in our task.
I fully agree. I just wanted to say that as the UN Special Rapporteur, I'm not part of the UN. I'm an independent expert. That's why I'm in no hierarchy here. But hopefully more connections are going to be discussed, and more ways to promote artistic freedom are going to be discussed in the next days. Just one last thing for me. Do not undermine the power of the United Nations. So if you, let's try to use all the tools that we have, and there are tools at the national level, there are tools, absolutely, the main tools are the civil society, but also tools at the national level, but also tools at the international level, the global level, not Council of Europe, but also the United Nations. International human rights tools are given to us to use them to promote artistic freedom. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your comments and for us to be able to listen to your discussion. I think it's given really food for thought for the upcoming days, and you will have the possibility to ask questions to these distinguished people during the days. I think what we have heard has really pointed out that the legal instruments are there, but we need to open up and see all the complex levels that live within here. We also have to take responsibility, every one of us, in the position that we have, and use that in various ways. And don't be scared either for it to be a little uncomfortable here and there, because it's going to be. So, thank you again.